Now, as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict intensifies, the United Nations calls for a ceasefire, the world watches, and we all hope and pray that hostilities can be tamped down. But back again to help us understand the situation is Dr. James Zogby. He's the founder and president of the Arab American Institute here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Zogby, you have seen the long arc of Israel-Palestine play out in U.S. politics. You mentioned 1976 till now. So what has been the driving force this entire time for the United States in seeing Israel as its ally in the region?
Well, look, it's domestic politics. I remember Harry Truman's famous quote when he was going to recognize Israel, and the State Department warned him that Roosevelt had made a commitment to the Arabs not to do that. And Harry Truman, in effect, said, "I'm president, not Roosevelt, and my Jewish constituents would want it." He had friends, he had associates, he had people who were interested in pushing this issue, and they did. And he said, "I had no Arab constituents." Well, he did, but they weren't organized and active on the question. That remained the issue, I should say, remained the issue for decades, where the Jewish community was very organized. Now the Christian fundamentalist community is very organized. And it's only in the last, I think, 5-6 years that we've seen a counterweight to that. Certainly Arab Americans, I like to think, played a role, but also progressive Jews. There's a great debate in the Jewish community, and certainly African Americans are decidedly different on this issue than white middle-class born-again Christians. So we've got a partisan divide here, and I think it's important. This is the first time we've got it.
And recognizing maybe when that took a turn, it maybe was the Obama administration. He and Netanyahu had a famously frosty relationship. How did the push for the Iran deal, diplomacy with one of Israel's enemies, change things here in the United States?
Well, one of the things it did was it exposed something that had been brewing, which was a Republican drift toward the Likud, the conservatives in Israel. That it started with Newt Gingrich. I mean, Gingrich made a pact with Netanyahu, and it was Republicans and Netanyahu against Clinton and Rabin. That remained, but it really got exacerbated during the Obama years, when Netanyahu literally was going to make war on the United States in terms of politics and push back, and joined forces with the far right in Congress and with the Christian right. And that lasted all the way up through the Trump administration, where you had Republicans with the far right in Israel and a growing shift on the Democratic side who were upset with Trump, upset with Netanyahu, becoming very supportive and knowledgeable about Palestinians, and felt that Obama had been screwed and they were going to go with the direction Obama wanted to push them. That's kind of what happened.
Knowing what we know now, is there any chance that the United States Congress will officially, formally, in a serious manner, I guess is the way to describe it, take up the idea of reconsidering U.S. aid, military assistance to Israel, as it has done with Saudi Arabia?
It did with Saudi Arabia, and it's done with other countries, but Congress lags far behind. I remember one time Walter Fauntroy, who was a congressman from here in the district, had gone to Lebanon to meet with Arafat and to try to become a peacemaker. And he came back, and I met with him, and I said, "Congressman, are your colleagues behind you?" And he said, "They're behind me, way behind me." And what's great in Congress is that we've got now a growing cohort of progressives in the Senate and in the Congress who are really moving in a very positive direction, saying really important things. But the Republicans are lockstep on the wrong side of this, and Democrats are still being timid and cowardly. Many Democrats are. But I think that this is beginning to grow and may put some pressure on the Biden administration to actually take a heavier hand, because Israel is doing what it's doing because it knows that there's no sanctions, no repercussions. So it acts with impunity like a spoiled child. Unless they know that there is a price to pay for the behavior that they're displaying, they will not stop. And that, by behavior, I mean land confiscation, home demolitions, the repression in the West Bank that is severe goes beyond Gaza, started way before this Gaza conflict. People want to say, oh, it's Hamas versus Israel. No, it's actually Israel versus the entire Palestinian people going back decades of repressive policies. That's kind of what we have to have an administration willing to say stop or else. If they don't say or else, Israel won't stop.
It's interesting you mentioned that in the context of Black American movements, and there have been efforts in Black communities to overcome police and state violence. And there have been different pathways to that. And we see that same bifurcation within the Palestinian community as well. Hamas is more militant. There's a democratically elected leadership in the West Bank, and they're all trying to figure out what the next steps are. Within that, there comes up this conversation about self-defense and what it means to defend against an oppressor. Government leaders in the U.S. use the phrase, Israel has a right to self-defense. But how does that language play into the narrative overall, especially when it comes to the Palestinian right to self-defense?
Look, if I were a Palestinian and my home were confiscated, or if I were a Palestinian and my land was stolen, I mean, we have people in this country who get into really violent conflicts with their neighbors when their neighbors plant bushes 1 foot over into their property. Palestinians, if you look at Bethlehem, just as an example, Bethlehem has lost 2/3 of its land to Israeli confiscation. It's become literally sort of strangled on all sides by settlements that were built on its land. And that has been a consistent Israeli practice over the last many decades, going back to the creation of the state when they did it to Nazareth. Nazareth owned all this land and then was literally strangled by Israeli settlements all around it. And so Palestinian self-defense would be, they have a right to resist that. They have a right to fight against it. Should they use violence? I think violence has been counterproductive. But do they have a right to defend themselves? Of course they do. And yet the U.S., you're right, uses that issue exclusively with regard to Israel, so that Palestinians are being pushed and choked and just treated in the most abominable ways. Hamas will use violence, and the U.S. will say Israel has the right to self-defense without asking the questions, what brought us to this point? And that's the difficulty, I think, in the way U.S. administrations have handled it. They start when look, it reminds me of a story. My daughter, when she was really little, 3, and my son was 7, one day I heard her screaming upstairs, and I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Joe hit me back." Well, she had been hitting him and provoking him and whatever, and he hit her. And that's where she wanted to start the argument. No, it doesn't work that way. Israel is at fault, and Hamas now is at fault. But the issue is we have to unwind it by looking at both sides equally. We don't do that.
And I'm going to leave it on that note, which is that there's enough blame to go around at this point, but the power dynamic is certainly one of imbalance of a police state and oppressed people. Dr. Zogby, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.